All right. Hello, everyone. So this is SIG scheduling meeting, May 2nd. Please note that this meeting is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. So please adhere to our code of conduct. We've got one topic on the agenda. Sanjay, I guess you wanted to present or discuss an idea of similar to pod groups and support for all or nothing or gang scheduling in upstream Kubernetes.
Yeah, it's just a early feedback kind of discussion, so shouldn't take
please
long.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so let me then quickly share my screen. Right. I hope you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's also came out of some of discussions we are having on the leader worker set document from Abdullah, and hi, I'm Sanjay Chatterjee. Let me introduce myself. I'm in NVIDIA. So we've been looking at gang scheduling for quite a while, and we've been looking actually internally. We've used gang scheduling quite extensively, and so I just wanted to provide a couple of ideas on how we can actually have native support in Kubernetes, and then gather some early feedback. This is nowhere close to a cap or anything, but I just wanted to put out some ideas, very simple ideas. And I think the main bar of getting gang scheduling in there is the idea of a pod group. And the pod group, what does it mean to have a pod group, and what are the characteristics of that pod group should be. And so it all depends on, there are different ways of people think about pod groups, and the simplest form is essentially just looking at like an aggregate type, like an array, where all of the pods in the pod group are essentially the same type or the same template spec. So one proposal is to basically use that concept. I mean, the array is a very simple concept, and you look at the same template spec, you can define it very easily, and the atomicity, they are of fixed size, and so you can have good atomicity guarantees and everything. So if you think about like a pod array as a native type in Kubernetes, what would that mean, right? So pod array is a fixed number of pods of the same template spec, and then the pods belonging to the pod array will have like gang scheduling all or nothing semantics. Basically, all the pods in the pod array will be scheduled together, and it also will have gang termination. If one pod terminates, all the pods in the pod array will terminate. Now, what does it mean to have pod arrays, right? In Kubernetes. So what it means is essentially there will be native integration in the scheduler, autoscaler services, and more. I mean, there needs to be discovery of the pods in an array, and it should automatically be inbuilt into different workload types in Kubernetes, so that they can have autoscaling properties as well using pod arrays. So I think that's been from the discussion that I was having with Abdullah on that. I think the autoscaling is one of the biggest sticking points, and I mean I agree. So I think we need to think about how to natively define this concept so that we can have autoscaling out of the box, essentially. So I mean, so if you just try to define a pod array, and this is very similar to what we have seen, like a pod array with a spec and a status, and then the spec is essentially a pod template spec, and the status would have something like a phase, similar to a pod phase, pending, running, succeeded, fail, unknown. I mean, they will have gang semantics, and so. And it comes because of the fact that we are using a fixed size and an arrays. I mean, these kind of properties and guarantees that you can get out of it. Now, the key idea over here is that, if you have one pod template spec, which can now be extended with a count, right? So we can say that, hey, if I have a pod template spec and I add a count to it, it means that I can actually start defining the same pod with multiple copies of it, right? The default value will always still remain one, and so that existing workloads can function exactly the same way it is. But if we, I think that the key insight is that if we can just simply add something called as a count, then we can define what an array type would be, right? And so what this means is that, of course, once a pod gets created out of this spec, a status would also have to indicate the index of this pod in the array. And so we'll probably have an index field in the status similar to that. Now, what does it mean, right? So what are the pros for this? Is that basically we can have array semantics, which is easy, simple to understand, atomicity, and all of this. They map well to SPMD computations, collective synchronization primitives we heavily use in NVIDIA. And this concept actually maps very, very well to what we actually are using today. And then the pod template spec allows native integration with existing workload types that support autoscaling today, like deployment, stateful set, replica set, and all of that. And so you kind of get the autoscaling support out of the box based on this. Now, what are the limitations for this? Is that, of course, we cannot have multiple pod template specs, so different pods of different type. Something that you will need for like MPMD computations or leader worker patterns to describe those kind of things. And also the other thing is that what I've seen in some of the existing proposals is that pod groups, they have this something called as a min member, right? So essentially supporting a min member, I feel, is somewhat of an anti-pattern for having gang scheduling, and adds too much complexity to have good, robust, guarantees for gang scheduling. So of course, that's another limitation to this pod array thing. I mean, for implementation, the scheduler will support a pod array type. We'll have gang scheduling plugins for scheduling preemption and other things that can go along with that. And the HPA will need to consider aggregate metrics from the pod array. And the resource scale up and down should just work out of the box without needing any changes, essentially. So this is like proposal one. I mean, now going forward, I think one of the bigger people are looking at is how to describe multiple pod template specs. And there are, of course, we can actually think about extending this above pod array pattern to have multiple pod array templates over here. And so what that would mean is that essentially we can think about extending what we defined in the pod array with an array of templates over here in the pod group spec. So let's call it a pod group, which is to differentiate it from the pod array. And so this pod group spec would essentially have something like as a templates array over here. And the pod template spec would in turn have that count. And so which means that you can essentially have different, you're essentially trying to describe multiple pod arrays in this pod group. So you can have pod A, B, C, D, whatever. And so the changes would still remain the same on the existing APIs that we add a count. But now with the pod group, there are newer index things that we need to think about. So if you think about, there is an array index, which is the index of the pod inside an array. But now we have to think about what is a group index, is basically what is the index of that pod template in that pod group. And so, and then there is a template index that we can think about. And sorry, the group index is essentially what I was thinking is like a global index of all the pods in that pod group. So, and a template index would be a index of that. So basically multiple set of indexes that we will have to come up with, and it becomes slightly more complicated in terms of like trying to think about it, but it kind of maps well to let's say structure of arrays concept in programming languages. So essentially pod template spec still has the same change with one extending it with account, and pod status is will have these set of index fields over here. So what are the pros for this? Basically, it supports multiple pod templates. You can have leader worker patterns, MPMD computations, and the pod template spec will allow native integration with the count that we can have is that you can still have deployments and stateful sets still use a way of like describing a block of pods or pod array for its own cases. But I mean, the limitation would still be that we want to make sure that the count of pods in a pod group still is fixed size. So we should not think about, we are not thinking about, the minimum number of pods that we want to have scheduled. So it's still an all or nothing with all of them that need to be scheduled. And now with this pod group, we can actually start integrating with higher level workload types like, Abdullah has got the leader worker set workload, and we can add the pod group to be included in that pattern so that not only we get the gang termination restart, but we should also get the gang scheduling part of it going as well. So, or we can actually start defining, even like similar to deployments, we can have a deployment groups or a stateful group spec, which can add these template arrays instead of having just one template. So, yeah. So, I mean, this is very, initial thoughts. I mean, feel free to, give me feedback, and I'll, share this link to the doc. And we can you can give me feedback. I mean, this is just very, very early thoughts over here. I'll shut up.
I have a lot of questions.
Yes.
So I think, first of all, defining the API is not hard. Actually implementing is the hard part.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of race conditions that could happen. So
Totally.
and then this goes also to the topic of cluster autoscaling. Just the fact that we have an API doesn't mean that it's easy to have autoscaling support for it. And that was it. That was what stalled the earlier proposals for pod groups.
Right.
Which, if you have seen, then there were proposals like maybe even 5 years ago or so, and more recently 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And they have been still pending on autoscaling implementation details.
Yeah.
Now that's one topic. The other topic I am here concerned about these indexes. So these are for the pod status, right? So for each of the pods. So are you saying that each pod is gonna get an index?
Right. So
from the scheduler? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So it kind of maps similar to what, let's say, if you have a grid of blocks like in CUDA, with thread ID, block ID.
Yeah, I understand that, but this doesn't sound like the right abstraction for it. I mean, we already have index jobs.
Right.
We have stateful sets. Why do we need a generic way of, like, what I'm trying to say is that it seems out of the scope of the scheduler to decide which pod is which element in the array or matrix. Yeah, what is your motivation? What is the limitation in the job API or stateful set or whichever else that makes the need for us to define it here.
I mean, I'm free for to discuss this and a bit, but essentially the fact that we looked at arrays, and typically in arrays you would have a size and an index. So you would like extending that concept to, let's say, a bunch of these arrays together means that form a group would mean that each of these so there are different kinds of orderings you can think about in for a pod, right? So how do you have a global rank kind of thing versus a local rank within a array? And yeah, so it I agree that it need not be part of the API, and it can be a specific workload type that defines it. And it doesn't need to be in the overall, like the base type over here. I mean, maybe like distributed PyTorch, for example, will need to have a way of like finding out, okay, this pod is part of, let's say, this particular group, and what is my local rank versus the global rank, and those kind of things. So, yeah, go ahead. That is a question.
I think like, because we want to list what are the problems we're trying to solve here, because this is trying to address multiple things, and they are not explicitly mentioned what they are. So we started with a discussion about gang scheduling, but then we evolved into addressing, how we create groups of pods, how we index them, and how we replicate them, etc. All of that has nothing to do with gang scheduling. So I think you want to list what are the problems that you want to solve here with this new abstraction. As Aldo mentioned, we have the job API that gives the semantic. You have also the job set API that exactly solves the problem you just mentioned, which is, I don't know if you've ever looked at it, at job set.
Yeah, so I did. The thing is that I'm not just looking to solve this for batch, right? I mean, this goes beyond batch. This is kind of a native spec. So that was the main idea. So if you want to have a way, I mean, if you want to have a way of like describing what is a group of pods that want to be gang scheduled, they need to have some properties, and that's what I was trying to define what the properties are going to be.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, there's another way to do it, right? Which is basically define what is a gang, right? And you can define it using a selector, and then with that descriptive API, anybody like can act on those pods, right? And because the thing is, with all of this, you need a controller to create the pods, you create the like the multiple pods, etc. This is not easy. Okay, like this is what, like, basically what you described here is what the job API is actually doing, irrespective of this is batch or not. But it's in terms of mechanics, what it's trying to do, at least on the like array, API is index job. Okay, like in terms of implementation. Now, that is not going to help you with how we address gang scheduling, right? Like I don't see anything here that says this is going to make gang scheduling easier, right? Like how would the scheduler implement it versus, for example, an API like pod disruption budget or HPA, and here like in the original implementation, a proposal, the PodGroup proposal, where you basically have a selector. What are a set of pods that form a group and needs to act? We need to treat them as a unit, right? And then how those pods are created is a separate concern of the workload controller, and we can create them in different ways. So that is, I guess, the thing that I feel like we could enhance this document with, right? Like, first is explicitly mention what are the problems we're trying to solve. This is trying to address something more than just gang scheduling. So I think we need to call them out. What existing APIs and solutions, why are they not good enough? And why is the existing PodGroup proposal not good enough? and how it would address its limitations. Those are, to me, still like it's not quite clear from I know this is early. I'm just giving feedback.
Yeah.
What I expect
I
next.
just wrote it last night, so it's
exactly. So and that's great. It's just basically if you're looking for feedback, this is, I guess, I'm pretty sure the community would be looking for.
absolutely.
And when we say autoscaling, we're not talking about HPA only. We're talking about cluster autoscaling, or infrastructure autoscaling, not just HPA. You want to mention the limitations here as well. Like this requires a new controller, basically under, I don't know, I'll call it apps or whatever.
Yeah.
It will require the scheduler, the HPA, the I don't know, like everybody to be aware of this new entity.
New
So
entity.
that is a significant change across the whole thing. So as Aldo mentioned, it's easy to come up with an API. What is the difficult part is how it would integrate and compose as well. How would we use it to compose? How compose with the existing things, and what can we use it for to compose like more complex solutions?
I totally agree, and we've been facing a lot of these challenges over the last few years, and we've been solving them, and we understand all the scale challenges, like how to actually manage all the concurrency issues and everything. And I feel that if we can define or limit the scope of what this pod group is, it kind of makes it easier for us to not just integrate in the scheduler, but also, let's say, things like the autoscaler, the DNS discovery, the services, and all of these things that will probably need to have changes to understand this native concept of what is a pod group. And that, I think, if we agree on that, then we can have a very small, limited way of defining what that pod group is, and then look at the impact over the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Right. I guess the point that I'm missing here is, what is the problem with the current setup that we're trying to solve, right? Like this is not explicitly called out, because everything you mentioned, I have solutions for, like more or less, other than that piece, which is how do I force the scheduler to not assign pods to nodes unless we know that they all can get assigned. So that is the piece, to me, is still missing in upstream Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see why having all this complexity would help solving it. And not would help solving it. Like, why is it all of that complexity necessary to solve that specific problem? And so if you're trying to solve other problems, we need to mention them as well, and then contrast with existing solutions.
Sounds good. Yeah, definitely. I would be happy to expand on this document a lot more and make sure that we cover all the things that you're mentioning over here, and so that I think natively, if you have this concept of a pod group, it becomes easier for like future enhancements to be aware that there is this concept of a pod group that they need to take care of. For example, DRA and things like that will what are the impacts on those kind of technologies going forward. We need to probably come up with these kind of debates and discussions going forward.
So one thought there, because that kind of was one of the problems of DRA, that was trying to be too generic and was trying to be, as you say, just get the API out of the gate and try to progress on it. But then we quickly realized that the API didn't work for autoscaling. It wouldn't ever, or it was becoming really complex to make it work with autoscaling, with cluster autoscaling. So we are starting from basically not from scratch, but we took a step back, and now we have a new working group, which is working in a different way than the original proposal. So the idea of a pod group, yes, we might need a concept like this, but we don't necessarily have to get the first API that we can come up with out of the gate, because it might cause problems. It might just cause delays down the line, and we want to avoid that, right?
Definitely. Yeah,
So,
I completely agree with that thought, because
yeah, so
we're not trying
what,
to solve the API problem. We are trying to solve the actual problem of how.
yes. So
Yeah.
my advice is the same as like 2 years ago. You have to consider cluster autoscaling from the beginning.
Yes.
How the API is going to interact with cluster autoscaling. And in the topic of cluster autoscaling, we already have an API,
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
which is called provisioning request, which kind of solves very similar problem. Is autoscaling focused first, right? Because it tries to atomically scale up for a pod request. But in another sense, is highly detached from what the pods are. So it's kind of like a promise, right? A promise, or I am I request capacity for all these pods that have this shape or this set of shapes, and then scale up happens, and then you submit your pods, right?
I'll take a look
So
at that as well. I mean,
it already solves the problem of gang scaling with a high level of confidence for autoscale environments.
Even the ones that are not, I think we have a solution for too, right? Like I mean, honestly, like cluster autoscaler could try to give you that promise as well on existing infra.
Yes. So you can also run a cluster autoscaler in a fixed size cluster and use the same provisioning request API to achieve gang scheduling as well. And then we have Q, right, which is let's call it a pre-check, quota check, before all of this happens, before we even request scale ups. So yeah, whatever new proposal comes in has to play with those existing components. And to some degree, hopefully we can avoid yet another API. I'm not convinced we will be able to, but we should try to avoid yet another API, because now if you want to scale a job, let's say you have a job object, you have the provisioning request object, Q has another object which is the workload, also kind of representing the same thing. So those three, and then you have all the pods, right? And then if we add yet another API, now we have another one, kind of all of them trying to solve the same problem in slightly different ways. So maybe I think for you it's better to have a review of what provisioning request is currently capable of,
I'll
the
review
cluster
that. Yeah.
autoscaler provisioning request, and see how we can either like
So
potentially make it part of upstream as opposed to being part of just cluster autoscaler. That's one option. Option two, no, I'm not sure what option two could be. Well, basically that we need a completely new API.
The
well,
existing. Yeah.
well, the thing is, if I have to think about from in the scheduler, I mean, we don't want to do pod by pod scheduling.
Yes.
If I want to avoid that, then we need to have a concept of the pod group in the scheduler in a standard way that all of these different APIs can talk about, right? So let's say if you have jobs and if you have other kinds of APIs that will probably try to, provide a standard specification of what that group of pods is, then the scheduler can make a decision of, okay, I know that I'm watching pod by pod, but together it means a pod group for me. If we can define that, I think that'll go a long way instead of like trying to have yet another pod group API. The goal of the pod group is that if we have that API, then that kind of standardizes the way that everybody talks to it.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying maybe a possibility is to bring the cluster autoscaler provisioning request upstream, up Kubernetes, and make that the API that everybody talks about.
And
Or
the
knows how
other
to.
thing is, again, the existing pod group proposal, right, with it would solve that problem, right? Like at the end of the day, you don't really want, like, I mean, you don't necessarily need an API that creates pods. You need an API that defines what is a pod group.
Yes,
So
exactly.
like, I'm talking specifically about gang scheduling. Just like if we're saying that this is the limitation, and so I want to keep double clicking on that because um, um, to me it's a significantly simpler approach. It works. It would work well with all existing, APIs that all the users are dependent on, right? Like job API, stateful set deployment, whatever, right? Um, and you wouldn't create another level of indirection, right? Like now, imagine like with PodGroup and whatever, like the other, like now you have an application API that will create. I'm not sure. Like you have two APIs, it will create that, and that will create the lower one, and then that will create the pod. Like you see, like the hierarchy gets extremely complicated, extremely deep, and makes it, I mean, like extremely hard to debug and reason about.
No, I think the current workloads who create pods, they just keep creating pods.
Yeah, I understand, but
Yeah.
like the thing is, like the goal is to create those groups, right? Like so, you need that new API
You
that
need a
does.
controller to merge them together into a group. Yes.
Yeah, so basically, we're gonna have to come up with a new deployment API, a new stateful set API, a new job API, and then those are gonna create these artifacts, like with the like three levels of hierarchy, right? Like three layers. Um,
No, with the current approach that I like, with this one that we just described, is that the template will have a count, which means that the deployment can automatically create an array of these pods. So it doesn't need to change anything other than just having a count to the template spec. So it automatically creates, I mean, if your template is the same, then it just makes it easy for the deployment to just say what is the count of that going spec that we need to create. So the number of pods automatically become part of a block or an array, whatever. So nothing changes.
I think it's like yeah, you're underestimating the change that needs to happen. But I need to look at the document to see exactly what is the semantics of that count and where you're placing it. I didn't quite uh, uh, get a good understanding of that.
Okay.
If you are asking that it will be part of the upstream pod spec, is that
Pod template spec? Actually, let me just
that deployment and job and everybody references?
exactly, yeah.
Okay, so who's going to act on that count then?
So let me just.
So basically, every single controller we have needs to change to look at that count. That's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah. So just imagine there's the simpler one, the pod array, which means that every pod has the same template spec. So what that means is that there is something called as a pod template spec that the deployment, the stateful sets, and everybody that they use, right? And that spec itself gets extended with a count.
Who acts on this count? Who looks at it and acts on
The
it?
controller which will actually create the pod, they will look at the count and create the pods based on the deployment spec.
I'm not sure I'm following. Maybe we can take a look at the document because that I'm not sure, Aldo, if you're following how
No, I also got lost here.
So this means that if I have a same pod template spec, I don't need to change any of my deployments or replica sets or stateful sets. I mean, they just remain the same, and you specify a count to the template. So you'd say like deployment templates spec.
But
account.
a lot of the APIs already have account, right? Job has account, deployment has account. So
No,
that would
those
be a
are
question too.
replicas, right? That's the replica. That's what I'm saying. I mean, so when you're talking about that count, is that is the replica which goes with the auto scale part of it. So think about, this is a pod array created from a deployment, right? So it's more native to, you would have to actually integrate separately with a
Okay,
different.
so you're saying we're having a new resource definition, which is the pod array in this case.
In this
right?
case, yes, exactly.
Yeah, so this is completely separate from the workload API. But then somebody has to create this object. And the question is who's gonna create it?
I'm still not following like who acts on this count. Like if you're saying that the deployment API itself, when it creates a pod from the template that is embedded in it, which now includes count, how does this relate to the pod group then? Is it going to create a pod group to do this, or like I'm not sure I understand the relationship between the pod group as a
So
concept.
right, so think about, like, if you have a deployment and a spec, which means that you're creating a bunch of these. So from a deployment, you're creating a pod, right? So, and with, if you have replica one, which means that you're just creating one. Now, if you have this count, which means that replica is still one, but now you're creating a count number of pods.
No, I understand that part, but like what do these like represent, those group? Because are you saying that who's gonna maintain, like define the relationship of this group? So that's what I'm saying. Like this is this a different proposal than the pod group above, or the same? That's where I get lost.
Okay,
Because
so
in my mind, for
this is
example,
just for the pod. Yes. So if you want to have a pod group with you, where you have multiple specs, then this cannot work with a deployment. It'll probably have to define a new workload, like a deployment group or something like that, which will have multiple specs in it. So which is going to be like something like you know
no,
deployments.
I'm not referring to different specs. I'm referring to the, like you have a pod group API at the top, which I
Okay.
thought is the one that, for example, a workload controller would basically create a group of pods,
Correct.
right? So that's what it is. So basically, the replica count and a deployment, let's call it pod group deployment. Okay.
Yes.
I have a question here, maybe. So
Just a second. Like, and then you it would create multiple pod groups, and then you have a controller called pod group controller that will say, okay,
Yes.
it will create whatever number of pods, right? So I guess the point here is like having the count inside the template. It like in my mind doesn't make a lot of sense because you need a controller that acts on it, right?
Yeah, so we have to
You
update
can't
the
rely
controller.
on the workload controller to act on that specific piece.
It will, yeah. So we have to make the control. We have to change the controller to act on it. That's what I'm saying.
But then, what is the purpose of the pod group controller?
So once you have a count, and this is just to make it work with the existing workloads.
Oh, okay, yeah.
yeah, so basically this is re-implementing index jobs plus gang scheduling. That's what I'm getting from this. Your proposal is re-implementing
for existing ones, yes. But you can have pod groups with newer workload types, that like leader worker set and everything, where each group can be now defined by a pod group.
Okay. That's gonna be a very hard pill to swallow. Because we invested a lot of effort in the job API and stateful set and so on. Because it's not just creating the pod, right? The pod might fail. So what do we do when it fails? So we have all these retry policies, upgrades. You know, these APIs have evolved to solve multiple needs. And then this one, it intends to be, if I understand correctly, it intends to be a new workload API that knows how to create pods in a very lightweight way. But lightweight might work for a year, and then in the next 10 years, it will end up looking exactly like the job API. And now we have two APIs that do similar things, but one does gang scaling and the other one doesn't. So that would create a lot of friction in the ecosystem, right? Which one should I support, right? Like if I'm building,
this is saying that you do gang scheduling for if you have a count more than one, it means that it automatically has to do gang scheduling.
How would the scheduler know though? Like I'm talking about the second case where you have the count inside the template.
In both cases, we have the count inside the template. You know, essentially, with having the count inside the template means that when you have when you're creating a pod, you're not just creating one pod, but you're creating a bunch of them together, and those will always need to be gang scheduled.
So a pod template describes a single pod template. I'm just like a count there that is misplaced. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. You will find it extremely hard to because like a pod is an entity. Like when you say count, then you're talking about like a higher level abstraction that needs to create X number of this template, right? So having it inside the template is just that it doesn't calculate. It doesn't add up, at least like in my mind.
It's a new concept. That's what it's a new concept of a native pod group.
Right, but then you need to call it pod group template. It's not a pod template, right? Which means that it's you'll not be able to integrate it as is with existing deployment and stateful. So that's what I'm trying to get to, right? It's not a picking on the name of that. What I'm saying is the existing pod template would never have a count. I would be extremely surprised if SIG architecture would actually consider this.
Yeah. So,
but again, I think if we are creating a new API that other APIs cannot use because they already have their own replica accounts, then also this doesn't fly. And again, because we invested on all these replication, restart policies, success policies, failure policies, all of that needs to be re-implemented for this.
No. So that's the thing. I mean, everything remains the same you just have to, all of the pods, they have the same semantics in the count. So let's say if I have count more than one, the restart policy remains the same for all of them. So
I understand, but what happens when one pod fails?
It's a gang termination. It's a gang termination. So if one pod fails, means all of the pods fail in this count.
But who's going to implement that gang termination? You need to change job API to do it. You need to change state. So because the part where it's contradicting is at one point you're saying nothing is going to change in these controls. It will just work. At the same time, you're saying it needs to do all of these semantics, but someone needs to implement those semantics, right?
Yeah. So I'm not saying that nothing needs to change in the implementation of the controllers, but I'm saying nothing needs to change on the existing specification of what is a.
So, Abdullah, if I can simplify, the proposal here is to create a new workload API. That's the proposal.
Well, that's what I'm trying to basically simplify it to. But like, I think Sanjay, you're also proposing that the existing deployment API, existing stateful set, to act on this new count field as well and implement, the group semantics, the gang scheduling, etc., all of these things. And what I'm saying is this is not going to make any progress. I'm being frank here, because you like the first one, it might, right? It might, like there is a chance that you would have a discussion, etc. Basically, you have a new API that describes a group of pods, right? And then you have, sure, you would create new workload APIs on top of it. Existing ones, I don't think this proposal would
So you're saying that
compose with them.
we will not have support in the community if we want to have native pod group support with existing APIs.
There is, again, based like, but not with this approach, right? Not with like,
how can I have, let's say, a deployment say that I want to create a block of pods?
You don't say that. You say rather my pods have to be scheduled together. I'm gonna create the pods, but the scheduler, you schedule them together, which is not the same thing. So it's still like the management of the pods still belongs to the job API or deployment, etc. So that's the fundamental difference.
And the idea from the original pod group is communicating to the scheduler what forms a group, right? Now, that piece is, in my mind, the missing piece. Not saying I need to create a group, right? Creating a group is the workload API, concern.
My point is, we need to think more than the scheduler. It's not just a scheduling problem for a pod group, because we have to think about one of the biggest challenges that we have seen is when you start all the user containers in a pod group, we need to have a synchronization point that after the init containers are done. And these kind of things are at runtime.
Yeah.
So
startup this is the same problem we're also trying to solve. Startup
exactly. I mean,
not like all or nothing startup, or whatever we're calling it, like startup, all or nothing restart, startup and restart, and scheduling, right? Like let's call them actually the this order. All or nothing scheduling.
What I'm saying is we have to think about the pod group.
One second here, because we are out of time, and I think this discussion should continue either in the working group batch or SIGAPS. Most likely, much better the working group batch.
I think
because we already have all the people. But SIGAPS has to have a say on this. This is beyond scheduling. I myself don't see. I think there will be a significant pushback on this proposal. But I think the best venue to continue is SIGAPS or working group batch.
And Sanjay, I think like the problems you mentioned is things that we've also been thinking about. So, but if you explicitly list them, it makes it much easier for the reader and the community to understand what like why this proposal is the way it is, right? Like, so that is the piece that I think makes it easier to understand.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to expand on this document. I think based on our discussions on that document, you said SIG scheduling would be like a good way of putting it out for early feedback.
Yeah, because there's a pod group proposal, which is extremely relevant.
But this goes, the native concept of a pod group goes beyond just scheduling, and it just runtime aspects of it and everything that we have to consider. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
I'm going to shut up and stop sharing.
All right. Thank you so much. See you folks next week.
All right.
Bye.